Lots of things happen when you're preaching in small churches. I remember one Sunday morning I was preaching at a little church, and I guess the cable had gone out, or either they had a bad snowstorm, but about every fourth shoulder in that building had a baby on it. And as we started the services and I started preaching, the babies got either hungry or hot, and they started. They whined and they cried and they bawled and they wailed. And I probably should have just stopped and said, as we stand and sing, and offered the altar call. But I was a younger preacher and decided I was going to work my way through this and I could out preach a bunch of screaming babies. Well, it was a struggle for the entire service. It was a battle. It was like dueling banjos, and one of the banjos was not properly tuned. Well, I finished this exhausting competition with the myriad babies of the children of Israel, and I walked back to the back of the building, and I drank some water out of the water fountain, and I leaned against the wall, and I unbuttoned my jacket. I was exhausted, and this old farmer came walking back. He was in a dress shirt with blue jeans and cowboy boots, and he leaned back against the wall, and he propped one of his boots against the wall. He looked at me and he said, "Well, preacher, when your calves are bawling, your herds are growing." And I want to say it was Jimmy Dunn. Jimmy Dunn was a pipeliner and he raised cattle in Velvet Ridge, Arkansas. And his perspective on what it meant to hear children cry in an audience changed my perspective of children crying in an audience. And I never hear a baby cry in a church building that I don't think about that old farmer in Velvet Ridge, Arkansas, with the perspective that as long as those babies are in the room making noise, you've got a growing herd. And another church building, and I think this was a little bitty church. I want to say I was in Pond, Tennessee, but I was in this little bitty church building. And there probably wasn't 100 people in there. And I'd been invited to speak that day, and I had driven over, and I was speaking. And the temperature in the building, it was early spring or early summer, but it was hot. The building was warm, and the ladies went to fanning themselves. They were using what I used to call the funeral home fans. The funeral home where I grew up had these fans, and they gave them to everybody that ever went to church, because they were in the back of the pews right behind the hymnals. Well, this is one of those small churches, and the ladies got a hold of the fans, and they were fanning. Some of the ladies were fanning themselves with the back of the hymnals. They were creating enough air, I believe I could have flown a kite in that building. While I'm preaching in these adverse circumstances, and the women are just fanning away. And I don't like to say it was distracting, but it was distracting. You're trying to preach, and you're trying to see if your audience is paying attention. And it looks like about half the congregation could take flight with all the flapping and fanning that's going on. And then all of a sudden, in the back right side of the building, this little gentleman stood up. He was wearing overalls and a suit coat jacket, and he had his little fedora type hat in his hand, and he stood up. And he starts down the side aisle. He's coming toward the front of the building. And I didn't know what was going on. I just kept preaching. I'm watching the flapping and the fanning like the bats leaving the cave. And this little fella's toddling up the aisle. And Tim Conway, as Mr. Tudball, could have beat him in a race. This little fella is easing up the aisle, and his back is bent, and he's shuffling his little steps. And I think, he's not going to make it to the front. He's probably not going to live long enough to make it to the front of this building. But I kept preaching, and he kept walking, and the ladies kept fanning. And he finally made it to the front of the building. And right there beside where I was preaching, he just walked up behind me and adjusted the thermostat. There was this thermostat on the wall, and he fiddled around. I believe it took him 2 minutes to fiddle around with this thing. He grabbed his little hat off the little table that he put it on. He turned around, he toddled back to his seat, and lo and behold, within 5 or 6 minutes, the flapping and the fanning stopped, and it became comfortable in the room, and we finished the services. Now, this is one of those days where you're going to preach, and then there's a dinner on the ground, and then you're going to preach again. And I like to call that an all-in-one service. It would probably be better called meal worship, but there's this trendy thing in the churches where they call it church eat church. And I don't know who invented that, but he should be taken outside and beat with a copperhead. I hate that phrase, church eat church, because it describes too many times what actually happens in churches. But anyway, We've had church, we've had the worship service, and we're sitting in the little fellowship area, and we've got dinner on the grounds, and I've got a plate of food and a glass of unsweet tea, and I'm sitting here eating, and the little gentleman with the suit coat, the overalls, and the hat comes toddling over with his plate, and he sits down, and we're enjoying a meal together, and he looks across the table at me and says, "Well, preacher, was it hot enough for you?" And I had to admit it was warm enough in the church building when things first got started. And then he said, about 4 or 5 years ago, we had an HVAC system put in the building. It's a brand new system that controls our heat and our cooling. That thermostat in the front ain't connected to it. He said, I just toddle up there every now and then and adjust them dials to keep them women happy. Now, if that's not the wisdom of an old farmer or a master psychologist, or maybe even a Jedi master, I don't know what it is. Or maybe it's just the common sense to understand the simple power of a thermostat. And a thermostat is different than a thermos. You know, there's that story, the guy, he's on a construction crew, and he's got a little paper sack, and as he's getting ready to eat his lunch, a guy sits down, and he has this massive thermos, and he undoes it, and the guy says, "What's that?" And his friend said, "Well, this is a thermos." He goes, "Well, what does it do?" He said, "Well, it keeps hot things hot, and it keeps cold things cold." "Oh, really?" "Yeah. So today I brought me some chicken and dumplings, and I'm going to have a hot lunch in my thermos." He said, "Well, I've never heard of nothing like that." Well, a couple of days later, the same gentleman who had just been introduced to the thermos shows up at work, and he's sitting by another worker, and it comes to, it's their lunch break, and he pulls this thing out. And his friend, who's not as smart as him, says, "What have you got there?" He said, "Well, this is called a thermos." He said, "Well, what does it do?" He said, "Well, it keeps hot things hot, and it keeps cold things cold." He said, "What do you have in it?" He said, "Well, I got tea and chili." Well, a thermos takes what is given it, and it keeps hot things hot, and it keeps cold things cold. A thermometer reacts to the environment. If it's hot, the thermometer rises. If it's cold, the thermometer goes down. But a thermostat, the power of the thermostat is that it can take a cold room and make it hot. And it can take a hot room and make it cold. Now, in the case of the Jedi farmer, it was the perception that he had the power to control the air, and that perception led the ladies in the audience to allow themselves to be controlled, because whoever controls your thermostat controls you. You see, our perceptions about how much power or how much control things or people have in our lives is one of the keys to why we can lose or gain joy or happiness. In Warren Wiersbe's book, Be Joyful, It Beats Being Happy, he says there are 4 things that rob us of joy: circumstances, people, things, and worry. We have those things. We let them have that kind of power over our happiness. Does the house you live in really control your joy? Does another person's acceptance, approval, rejection, or negative reaction to you really have the power to control your joy? You see, when you start talking about circumstances in life, whether they're actually circumstances, the economy, wealth, health, or it's other people and their interaction or their reaction to you, it's really going to boil down to a question of being regulated or being the regulator. Who controls your thermostat? Are you the thermostat, or are you the thermometer? Are you the thermostat, the thermometer, or the thermos? Do you just take things as they are? Do you react to things, or do you regulate things? Now, that's not to say that circumstances aren't ever truly adverse. That's not to say that circumstances can't be difficult or overwhelming, and it's not to imply that difficult people are as pleasant and easy to get along with as other people, but it is to say that in those circumstances and in those environments and with those people, the only thing that we can actually regulate or control is not their behavior, but our response to their behavior. The same is true about the environment or the circumstances we find in ourselves. You see, the inability to control the environment does not mean we cannot regulate our response to the environment. John Gottman, a famous marriage therapist, talks about couples in conflict. And when he's talking about couples in conflict, he basically says he looks for 4 markers or 4 things that he uses to predict divorce. In fact, years ago, Gottman said he could sit in a room with a couple and listen to them argue for 10 minutes and predict divorce with like 95% accuracy. And what he identified in couples was what he called the 4 horsemen of the relationship apocalypse. He talked about contempt, defensiveness, negativity, and stonewalling or withdrawal, where one partner just simply says, I'm done, and disengages. And for years, I've taught in marriage seminars, and for years in working with couples, I've said that the speaker is in control of contempt. But I've come to realize that contempt can be real or perceived. So you can say something to me and mean it with good intentions, but I can perceive it as contemptuous. I can perceive it as harsh. I can perceive it as demeaning. I can perceive it as attacking. So let's take the worst case scenario. And you've got someone speaking to you and they're full of contempt, and the contempt is intentional. Well, as the hearer, as the thermostat, I can regulate my response to your contempt. I don't have to let your contempt control me. I don't have to be that thermos and say it's hot, so it's hot, it's cold, so it's cold. I don't have to be the thermometer and say, well, because of this, I have to react this way. Now, I'd like for you to say it differently. But once you've said it, I can choose to hear it. I can choose to interpret it. I can choose to regulate it differently. And now I get it. And then we don't have time to talk about, toxic people. But mean people are mean and rude people are rude because they've learned along the way that is how they get their way. But if I'm going to thermostat that, if I'm not going to thermos it and I'm not going to thermometer it, but I'm going to thermostat it, the first thing I have to do is not react, not just accept it as hot or cold and not let it change the way I am, but rather than react, I'm going to control my response to it. Now, even though the delivery was harsh, or even though the delivery was rude, even though the delivery was impatient or demeaning, I can adjust the dial and ask myself, what is the underlying need? Now what they've said in an inappropriate way. In a perfect world, perfect people express unhappiness as a positive request to have their needs met. So when an imperfect person uses an imperfect delivery, I can let that heat me up. I can become defensive, or I can regulate my response by asking myself, underneath all the harshness, underneath all the negativity, underneath all the drama, is there an underlying need that they're wanting to be addressed? Is there an underlying need that they're asking me to meet? You see, the whole idea of if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If your enemy is thirsty, give him a drink comes to mind. It's finding a way to take what you're saying and not get lost in how you said it, but finding a way to take what you've said and look for that need and to deliver a need rather than simply the need to react to your delivery. Now that's a vital skill in being a thermostat person. Now, in the little church in Tennessee, were the people actually cooler? Or did they simply feel cooler because of what the Jedi farmer did? You see, when he toddled up to the front of the building and started messing with dials, they interpreted his action as an attempt to meet their needs. But in all actuality, he was faking them out. He was tricking them. And I guess, honestly, he was actually manipulating them. But what they chose to believe, or at least what they interpreted what he'd done, was addressing their needs. And at least in their minds, the temperature in the room got cooler. Our willingness to interpret the other person as asking for a need or trying to be benevolent is the difference in whether we're a thermos, a thermometer, or a thermostat. Jackie has the ultimate thermostat saying. It's on a sign in our house. It's a little piece of wood, and it hangs in the hallway right at our bedroom, and it simply says, choose happiness. Now, that's not to say she does not have wants, and it's not to say she doesn't have complaints, and it's not to say that she's never has any disappointments. But what it does say is that over the years, she's adopted a mindset that ultimately she's the one who regulates her own happiness. And that in spite of how other people behave, in spite of circumstances, in spite of things, and in spite of worry, she's the one who regulates her own happiness. And in talking about self-regulation, and talking about response to our own emotions rather than other people's actions, inactions, or interactions, Daniel Goleman, in his book Emotional Intelligence, describes it like this. And there's basically 4 points. Is a verbatim quote out of Goleman's book on page 45. Number 1, self-regulation. This is managing emotions. Handling feelings so that they are appropriate is the ability that builds on self-awareness. This includes self-soothing, shaking off rampant anxiety, gloom, irritability, and the consequences of failure. Those who are poor at this skill are constantly battling feelings of distress. Number 2, motivating oneself. This is marshaling emotions in the service of a goal and is essential for paying attention, for self-motivation, mastery, and for creativity. Emotional self-control, the ability to delay gratification and stifling impulsiveness, underlies accomplishment of every sort. And then number 3, recognizing emotions in others. Empathy. Another ability that builds on the emotional self-awareness is the fundamental people skill. People who are empathetic are attuned to the subtle social signals that help them interpret and indicate what other people need or want. And then number 4, handling relationships. This is the skill in managing emotions in others. This is the tipping point between social competence and social incompetence, and the specific skills involved in dealing with competence and incompetence. And these abilities undergird popularity, leadership, and interpersonal effectiveness. Self-soothing, shaking off rampant anxiety, gloom, irritability, and the consequences of failure. Those who are poor at this skill are constantly battling feelings of distress. Those who are poor at this skill have allowed others to be in control of their intrapersonal thermostat. And by giving someone else this control, by default, you've given up the ability to regulate your own temperature. You've given up the ability to regulate these circumstances. And by default, when you give up this skill, by default, you've given control away of your intrapersonal thermostat. And by default, you become a thermometer.